They said Adrian Vale had buried 3 men with his bare hands and never lost a night's sleep over any of them. They said his first wife had died of a broken heart, not grief, not illness, not any cause a physician could name, but the slow suffocation of living beside a man who had excised every soft thing from himself and left nothing behind but bone and iron will. They said when he walked into a room, the temperature dropped. Not metaphor, actual cold. As though his body had learned somewhere in the long, brutal education of his life to radiate something other than warmth. Elena Marlowe had heard every one of these stories. She had cataloged them the way a soldier catalogs the terrain. Before a battle, she already knows she cannot win. And on the night she became his wife, standing in the doorway of a bedchamber that smelled of stone and old candle wax and something indefinably like grief, she heard his voice for the first time without a crowd between them, low, flat, absolute, and understood that every single story had been an understatement. Dumb. The ceremony had taken 40 minutes. Elena had counted. Not because she was nervous, or not only because she was nervous, but because counting was the thing her mind reached for when it needed to stay tethered to the ground. 40 minutes from the moment she stepped into the great hall of Valemont Cathedral on her father's arm, her face arranged into the careful blankness that had taken her 22 years to perfect, to the moment the officiant closed his book and the scattered assembly of nobles offered their thin, performative applause. 40 minutes to transfer her, legally and irrevocably, from the Marlowe family's problem column to Adrian Vale's. The Duke of Valemont had not looked at her once during the ceremony. She had noticed that too. He stood at the altar like something quarried rather than born. 6 feet and 2 inches of absolute physical authority, his dark formal coat so precisely fitted it might have been armor, his jaw set with the specific tension of a man enduring something deeply inconvenient. His eyes, when she finally saw them up close as the officiant joined their hands, were a gray so pale they were nearly colorless. The kind of eyes that processed rather than saw, that cataloged and filed and moved on without sentiment. He had looked at her hand when the officiant placed it in his, not at her face, at her hand, the way you'd look at a document you were signing under duress. She had decided in that exact moment that she would not spend the rest of her life trying to earn a glance. The wedding feast lasted 3 hours, and Adrian Vale said 6 words to her, all of them functional. The wine is from the East Vineyards. The chair is lower than I realized. He corrected the chair problem without waiting for a servant, simply stood and moved it himself. A small, abrupt gesture of competence that somehow made everything worse, because it suggested that he was capable of consideration, just not inclined to extend it to her specifically. She had eaten the food placed in front of her. She had answered the questions posed to her by the court's senior ladies with the same careful blankness she'd worn through the ceremony. She had smiled when smiling was required and lowered her eyes. When lowering her eyes was required, and said twice that she was very grateful for the duchy's welcome, and both times she had meant it in exactly the way you mean something you're saying, because the alternative is silence, and silence at a wedding feast draws attention you cannot afford. Adrian had watched his nobles with the focused, measuring gaze of a man taking inventory. Occasionally he spoke, to his chamberlain, to the court's military commander, to a thin-faced man Elena would later learn was the duchy's spy master. When he spoke, people listened, not the way they listened to her father, who commanded attention through volume and practiced charm. Adrian commanded it through something quieter and considerably more dangerous. The room understood, on some animal level, that his words were not invitations to discussion. They were conclusions. At one point, the elderly Countess Hartwell, pink-cheeked from wine, leaned across the table and patted Elena's hand and said, "You are braver than you look, my dear," with the tone of someone paying a compliment while delivering a warning. Elena had smiled. "I've been told that before." The Countess had withdrawn her hand and said nothing further. The guests dispersed by midnight. The great hall emptied with the particular haste of people who had fulfilled an obligation and were eager to discuss it privately. Elena stood in the corridor outside the hall while her ladies gathered her cloak and her small personal case. She'd been instructed to pack light, that her household goods would follow. and felt the specific weight of what had just happened settle into her body like water into stone. She was Duchess of Valemont now. The title felt less like an elevation and more like a door closing. Her ladies brought her upstairs to the ducal apartments with a brisk efficiency that suggested they'd been briefed on exactly how minimal tonight's rituals would be. The suite was vast and cold. Cold in the way that very old buildings are cold, where the stone itself has absorbed centuries of winter and releases them slowly into every room regardless of season. The furniture was expensive and dark and heavy. The bed was enormous. The fireplace had been lit, but the fire was losing its argument with the room's ambient chill. Her ladies helped her out of the wedding gown, which had been beautiful and uncomfortable in equal measure, and into a nightgown that was perfectly respectable and which she would have preferred not to be wearing when she met her husband in private for the first time. There was no good option. She chose dignity over pretense, sat at the vanity while her ladies unpinned her hair, and refused to look like she was dreading the knock at the door. She was absolutely dreading the knock at the door. It came at midnight. "Leave us," said the voice on the other side, and her ladies were gone before the sentence finished. He was still in his formal clothes. He hadn't bothered to change, which meant this visit had been a decision made quickly, or a decision made reluctantly, or both. He stood in the doorway for a moment with his hand still on the frame, looking at the room, not at her, at the room, with the expression of a man running rapid internal calculations. Then he came inside. He didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room with his hands at his sides, and his pale eyes finding her face with a directness that was almost violent after hours of conspicuous avoidance. "I'll say this once," he said, "and I expect you to hear it clearly, because I won't repeat it, and I won't soften it." Elena was sitting at the vanity with her hair loose around her shoulders and her hands folded in her lap. She kept her spine straight and her face still, and said, "All right. This marriage is a political arrangement. The Marlowe family's eastern landholdings give the duchy access to 3 critical trade routes that our current borders cut us off from. Your family's debt to the crown is substantial. This arrangement resolves both problems efficiently." He said it the way you read a legal document aloud, flat, precise, without embarrassment, which was somehow worse than embarrassment. "I don't intend to pretend otherwise with you. I've been advised that would be kinder. I disagree. Pretense sets expectations that create complications." "I'm aware of the terms," Elena said. Her voice stayed level. She had practiced level. "Then you're aware that affection is not among them." He paused. "I want to be explicit about that specifically. Don't expect love from me. Don't expect warmth. Don't expect the kind of marriage your court ladies have been whispering about since the engagement was announced. I have no interest in a performance." The fire in the grate shifted. The light changed. In the new shadow, his face looked carved from the same stone as the castle walls, the same old, cold, immovable material. "You'll have your own suite," he continued, "your own household, an appropriate allowance and full access to the estate's libraries and grounds. The staff will respect you as Duchess. I will not undermine your authority with the household. What I will not provide is—" He stopped. Something crossed his face. Not discomfort exactly, more like the recognition of a word he didn't want to use. "Companionship," he finished, or its implication. Elena looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of several things simultaneously. She was aware that she was sitting in a nightgown in a cold room on her wedding night being told, with surgical precision, that her husband found the concept of caring for her categorically uninteresting. She was aware that she had known something like this was coming. Her father had not hidden the nature of the arrangement, had in fact presented it to her as evidence of his own pragmatism, his ability to solve 2 problems with one strategic marriage. She was aware that she had spent the last 3 months building walls in herself, teaching herself not to want things she was not going to get. And she was aware, in some deeper and more honest part of herself, that hearing it said out loud like this, "Don't expect love from me," was a different thing entirely from knowing it abstractly. That there was a specific kind of damage done by being looked at with that flat, measuring gaze and found categorically insufficient. She did not let any of that reach her face. "Thank you for being direct," she said. He blinked. It was the first unguarded thing he'd done. Most people don't say that. Most people find directness uncomfortable because it removes their ability to claim they were misled. She kept her voice even. I prefer to know where I stand. He studied her for a moment, that pale, processing gaze. Good, he said finally. Then we understand each other. He left without another word. The door closed behind him with a soft, definitive click that was somehow worse than a slam. Slams implied feeling. That click implied she had simply been a task, completed and moved off the list. Elena sat at the vanity for a long time afterward, looking at her own reflection. Where I stand, she had said. What she hadn't said. What she filed away in the part of herself that processed rather than felt, that cataloged and survived rather than crumbled, was that she'd been standing on unstable ground her entire life. A household that valued her only as currency. A family that had loved her, in their way, but loved the strategic uses of her more. An engagement to a man who had made it plain, with remarkable efficiency, that he had no capacity for her. She had survived all the preparation. She could survive the thing itself. She blew out the candle on the vanity and got into the enormous bed and listened to the castle settle around her. The groan of old stone, the distant sound of wind off the northern ridgeline, the deep territorial quiet of a place that belonged to someone else entirely, and told herself, with the certainty of someone who has had considerable practice, that she was fine. She was almost sure she was right. 6 weeks into her marriage, Elena had developed a precise map of Valemont Castle. Not a physical map, though she'd mentally cataloged that too. The 3 main corridors, the back staircase that let her avoid the morning traffic of courtiers seeking Adrian's attention, the garden entrance that bypassed the Great Hall entirely. What she'd mapped more carefully was the territory of the man himself, where he was at what hours, which rooms he used, which he avoided. The geography of a person who moved through his own home like he was trying to minimize contact with it. Adrian Vale rose before dawn. She knew this because she had heard him, those first few disorienting mornings when her sleep was still adjusting to the castle's particular sounds. Footsteps in the corridor outside her suite. Unhurried, purposeful, gone before the household stirred. He trained in the courtyard with his guard captain, a scarred veteran named Rourke, who had the bearing of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything decades ago. She had seen them once from her window, in the gray pre-light of early morning. Adrian, without his formal coat, in a plain shirt and dark trousers, moving through forms with the kind of efficient, practiced violence that made clear he was not a man who kept soldiers because fighting was beneath him. He fought because fighting was something he was still good at, because it was honest, because it required nothing from him except capability. He breakfasted alone in his study. He met with his advisors through the morning hours. He rode the estate boundaries 3 days a week with a small escort, returning dusty and quieter than he'd left, as though whatever he encountered out there required him to carry something back. He dined in the great hall when court was in session, at the head of the table, flanked by his chamberlain on one side, and whatever matter of business currently required his attention on the other. He dined in his study on the other evenings. He had not invited Elena to dine with him privately once. This was, she had decided, perfectly acceptable. She was building her own rhythms. She had claimed the eastern sitting room as a kind of unofficial office. It had better light than her formal suite and was far enough from the main corridors that people didn't wander past it accidentally, and had begun the considerable work of understanding the duchy she now presided over. The household accounts were meticulous, which told her something about the man who'd ordered them kept that way. The estate records went back 4 generations. The staff roster included 43 names, and she was working her way through learning all of them, not because she was required to, but because people who felt seen by the person above them worked differently than people who felt invisible. She had learned this from watching her father's household fail repeatedly to function with any coherence, and understanding it was because the people running it were interchangeable to him. They were furniture he didn't notice until it broke. She refused to replicate that. The first time Adrian Vale did something unexpected was on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into her residence, when Lady Cressida Vane cornered Elena in the portrait gallery with 3 other women and systematically dismantled every aspect of Elena's background, her family's reputation, her physical appearance, and her prospects as Duchess in the space of approximately 7 minutes. It was done with the particular artistry of women who have spent their entire lives sharpening social cruelty to a point fine enough to pass through silk without catching. Lady Cressida was the daughter of the court's senior lord, beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, and had apparently spent some time as a significant presence in Adrian's life before the political marriage made that arrangement inconvenient. She made sure Elena understood this in the first 90 seconds. Elena had stood very still and listened and let the words move through her without catching and had not notably cried. This she was proud of later, though at the time she'd been operating purely on the necessity of not giving Cressida the satisfaction. She had excused herself with a minimum of words and walked back to her sitting room and sat down at her desk and resumed reading the duchy's drainage records, which were frankly less toxic than the portrait gallery had been. She did not mention it to anyone. The next morning, at breakfast in the Great Hall, one of the communal meals she attended because her absence was more conspicuous than her presence, she watched Adrian arrive, greet his chamberlain, and then pause near the entrance as Lady Cressida approached him with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this greeting many times. Adrian did not greet her back. He looked at her with those pale, flat eyes for a moment, and then he said something Elena couldn't hear from across the room. Whatever it was brief, because it had barely finished before Cressida's expression underwent a rapid and unpleasant transformation, the social mask cracking at the seam, and she withdrew. Not gracefully, not on her own terms. She withdrew the way you withdraw when the other person has removed the scaffolding of courtesy from the conversation and left you standing in something less comfortable. Adrian crossed the hall to the head table without another glance at her. He did not look at Elena either. But his chamberlain appeared at Elena's elbow approximately 20 minutes later and said, quietly, that the Duke had suggested the portrait gallery might benefit from being temporarily closed for a cataloging assessment. It would be unavailable to social gatherings for the foreseeable future. Elena had absorbed this. "Tell the Duke I appreciate the catalog effort," she'd said, and the chamberlain had not quite smiled and had withdrawn. She hadn't known what to do with it. So she had filed it in the same place she'd been filing the other inexplicable small things, the fire in her sitting room that was always lit before she arrived, which she'd initially assumed was standard household procedure until she noticed it happened even when her arrival time was irregular. The book that appeared on her desk without explanation 3 days after she'd mentioned, in passing to a maid, that she'd been trying to find a specific text on the duchy's agricultural history. The fact that the particularly aggressive courtier who'd twice cornered her with questions clearly designed to assess her political usefulness had been quietly reassigned to an ambassadorial post in the far eastern provinces. She hadn't asked about any of it. She wasn't sure she wanted the answer. What she understood about Adrian Vale over those 6 weeks was that he was not the man the court thought he was. This was not a romantic realization. She was careful about that. The court believed one of 2 stories, that he was a monster who had destroyed his first wife through neglect and cruelty, or that he was a tragic figure whose first wife's death had shattered him and left behind something hollowed and cold. Neither story was interested in accuracy. Both stories were interested in narrative, in having a shape to put around a man who otherwise defied easy categorization. The truth, as Elena was mapping it, was more specific and considerably more uncomfortable. Adrian Vale was a man who had built a precise and functional system for surviving without vulnerability. Every cold angle of him was load-bearing. The distance was deliberate. The silences were deliberate. The absolute refusal to invite or offer tenderness was the product of something that had happened before she arrived, something that had convinced him, at a level below reason, that the cost of caring for something was always its loss, and that the only rational response to that equation was to stop carrying anything worth losing. She understood this because she had been running a version of the same system for 22 years. She was less advanced in the project than he was. She had not yet managed to excise warmth entirely. But she recognized the architecture. She understood the purpose of the walls. And because she understood it, she was capable of something the court was not. She could see the man behind the structure, and what she saw was not a monster and not a tragic romantic hero, but simply someone who was very tired of being hurt and had found a way to make sure it couldn't happen again. She was not going to mistake that understanding for connection. She was very firm about that. The crisis arrived on the 38th day of her residence, on a cold evening when the court was gathered for a diplomatic dinner hosted by a visiting lord from the northern provinces, and Elena's brother arrived unannounced. Thomas Marlowe was 3 years her senior and shared their father's gift for entering rooms like he owned them. He was also, she had known for some time, in a significant amount of financial trouble that had nothing to do with the family's formal debts and everything to do with private arrangements their father didn't know about. He kissed her cheek in the entrance hall before the dinner, smelling of travel and the particular kind of nervous energy she associated with him when he needed something. "Elena," he held her at arm's length, "you look well. Marriage agrees with you." "You didn't tell father you were coming," she said. Statement, not question. "Father is in the capital." He shrugged it off. "I thought I'd pay my respects to the new household, see how you've settled in." "Thomas." "A private word before the dinner?" She took him to the eastern sitting room because it was hers and because she could close the door. She sat across from him with her hands folded and waited. He needed 40,000 crowns. He needed it within the month. He had acquired this debt through a series of investments in a trade venture that had collapsed, and the man he owed was not the kind of man who negotiated extensions. And if he didn't resolve it, there would be consequences of a nature he declined to specify, but which she understood from the way his jaw was set, involved threats she was meant to take seriously. "I don't have 40,000 crowns," she said. "You're the Duchess of Valemont." "I have a household allowance, not access to duchy funds." She kept her voice flat. "You know this." "You could ask him." Thomas's eyes moved to the closed door. "Your husband. He has more money than God. 40,000 is a rounding error to a man like—" "Stop." She said it without heat. "You're asking me to go to a man I've known for 5 weeks and request funds for your private debt in a marriage that exists purely because this family couldn't manage its obligations responsibly. Do you hear yourself?" Thomas's face did something complicated. He wasn't a bad man. She had never thought he was a bad man. He was a man who had been given too much freedom to make poor choices for too long and had never developed the capacity to face their consequences. "Elena, I'll find another way," she said. "Give me the name of the creditor and the specifics of the debt. I have some personal funds from Mother's estate that haven't been reassigned. It won't cover all of it, but it might buy time." "That's your money. Mother meant that for you. Mother meant it to give me options. This is me using one." She stood. "We need to go to the dinner." Thomas stayed 2 nights. He was charming at dinner. It was genuinely one of his talents, and she watched him work the table with the ease of someone who had learned to make rooms like him before they could identify the specific emptiness at the center of the performance. The northern lord was delighted by him. Several of the courtiers found him refreshing. He was good at seeming like exactly what you needed him to be. She saw Adrian watching him, not with the measuring gaze he used on people he considered a threat. Something more careful than that, more attentive, as though he was reading a text he'd encountered before in a different edition. On the second evening, she came back from a late walk in the castle gardens to find Thomas and Adrian in the corridor outside the study. Not in conversation, Thomas was speaking, Adrian was listening, which were different things, and she caught the tail end of something she wasn't meant to hear. "Appreciate your understanding. Elena doesn't need to know about our arrangement." She stopped walking. Adrian's eyes found her over Thomas's shoulder with the flat, immediate precision of someone who had registered her arrival before she made a sound. Thomas turned. His expression did something rapid and self-correcting. "Elena," Thomas said, "we were just—" "Good night, Thomas," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She was extremely proud of this. She went to her suite and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and worked through what she'd heard with the methodical care of someone who knew that the alternative to careful thought was the kind of reaction that made things worse. Thomas had gone to Adrian, behind her back, with the specific instruction that she not be told. The interpretation that felt most obviously correct was that Thomas had asked Adrian for money, which meant the problem she thought she'd contained, the debt, the creditor, the consequences Thomas had implied but not named, was larger than she'd understood, larger than her mother's estate funds could handle, large enough that Thomas had decided, in the absence of a better option, to go over her head to her husband and ask for a solution she'd explicitly declined to pursue. The interpretation that felt more frightening, and which she could not stop her mind from running, was that the arrangement Thomas had referenced was not about money, or not only about money. Her family had used her as currency once. She was here, in this castle, as evidence of their proficiency at that particular transaction. She had not fully allowed herself to think about what else they might negotiate. She didn't sleep. At some point before dawn, she gave up on the pretense and wrapped herself in a heavy robe and went to the window seat and watched the courtyard below. The darkness was beginning to soften at its edges. The sky over the eastern wall was turning from black to the deep blue that preceded light, and there, in the courtyard, was Adrian. Not training this morning. He was standing near the far wall with a lantern, alone, no guard captain, no escort. Just a man standing in the pre-dawn cold of his own home, with his arms at his sides and his head slightly down, as though he was attending to something that lived beneath the surface of the visible world. She watched him for a long time. She couldn't read anything from this distance. She didn't know if he was thinking about her or about Thomas, or about something that had nothing to do with either of them. Something from before she arrived, from the deep interior geography of a life she had no access to. He was a man she'd shared a building with for 38 days, and she knew his schedule, and she'd glimpsed the edges of his consideration, and she understood the load-bearing function of his coldness, and she did not even slightly, know what he carried in the quiet he kept closest to himself. He looked up. She did not move away from the window fast enough. His eyes found the light of her window across the dark courtyard and held it, and she felt the distance between them collapse in some non-physical way. The specific, uncomfortable sensation of being seen by someone who had been very deliberately not seeing you. It lasted only a moment. Then he looked away. He crossed the courtyard toward the east entrance without haste and without looking back. She sat with her forehead against the cold glass for a long time. "Don't expect love from me." She wasn't. She was extremely clear about that. She was simply a person who had been lying awake all night rearranging the pieces of a situation that had quietly stopped being what she thought it was. That was all. Thomas left the next morning before breakfast. He kissed her cheek and told her not to worry, that everything was handled, and she looked into his face and understood that he believed this and was relieved by it and had decided that whatever he'd arranged was preferable to the alternative. She did not ask him to explain. She was not sure she could maintain her composure through the explanation. She went to her sitting room. She opened the drainage records. She stared at them for 20 minutes without reading a word. Then she closed them, stood, and walked down the corridor to the study. She knocked. "Come." He was at his desk with documents spread in front of him and the expression of a man who had been working for several hours. He looked up when she came in. His face did not change, which was itself a kind of information. "You spoke with my brother," she said. "Yes." "Without telling me. He asked me not to." "I heard him ask you that." She kept her hands at her sides. "I'm asking you now what was said." A beat. Something moved through the pale eyes that she couldn't name. "He came to me with a debt situation," Adrian said. "I resolved it." "How?" "Financially. Without consulting me. He presented it as a personal matter separate from your household." He set down the document he'd been holding. "I made a calculation about what you would want and what would serve the duchy's interests, and I acted on it, in that order." The last 3 words sat between them in the silence. She hadn't expected that. "Why?" she said. The word came out quieter than she intended. Adrian held her gaze. In the morning light, his face was less cut-stone and more human. There were lines around his eyes that she hadn't noticed from a distance, the particular evidence of a face that had spent years holding itself taut against expression. "Because your brother's creditor," he said carefully, "is not a private citizen. He works for Lord Casson." The name landed. Lord Casson, the court's most senior lord, the man who had opposed the Vale Duchy's expansion for a decade, the man whose daughter Cressida she had dismissed from the portrait gallery. "The debt wasn't about trade investment failures," she said. "No. Thomas doesn't know that." "No. He was being used." Her voice was completely steady. She was distantly impressed with herself. Someone used my brother's financial vulnerability to place a lever near me, to give Lord Cassine's faction access to... She stopped. To me, to what I might access, or what I might be pressured to report. Adrian said nothing, which was confirmation. How long have you known? 3 days. You've known for 3 days that my family is being targeted to get to me, which means to get to you, and you... She stopped again, breathed. You handled it by paying the debt, which removes the immediate lever but doesn't address the... She turned to the window. Outside, the sky had completed its transition from night to a flat, colorless morning. You should have told me. Silence. Yes, he said. She turned back. His expression was... She had no word for it. Not closed, which was its usual state. Not open either. Somewhere in the narrow band between, where things existed that hadn't been allowed through in a long time. I should have been told, she said. I am not a person to be managed around. I am not collateral in this situation. I am... She stopped because the sentence threatened to become something she wasn't prepared to say. I can be useful to you if you let me. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. It was such a simple answer, such a plain, direct, unmistakably genuine answer with none of the deflection or procedural distance she'd come to expect from him, that she had no immediate response to it. She stood there in the gray morning light of his study, in the silence of a castle that had felt like a tomb when she arrived and had very slowly, in 38 days, begun to feel like something slightly less final, and looked at the man she'd married who had just quietly told her that he was aware of her worth and had not known what to do with that awareness. And the door to the corridor opened without a knock. Rourke, the guard captain, stood in the frame with the specific posture of someone carrying news that cannot wait. Your Grace. His eyes moved from Adrian to Elena and back. We have a situation in the East Passage. Lord Cassine's man has been found. He paused. He was searching the Duchess's personal suite. The silence that followed lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then Adrian was on his feet, and the man she'd spent 38 days mapping, the cold one, the careful one, the one who had built his entire existence around the principle of not caring about anything he could lose, crossed the room toward the door with an expression she had never seen on his face before and would not, in the immediate shock of recognizing it, be able to name until much later. It was fury. Not the cold administrative kind, not the measured, calculating anger of a man who had been politically outmaneuvered. The other kind, the kind that lives below strategy. The kind that gets loose when something you told yourself you didn't care about turns out to be the thing you cannot tolerate losing. He stopped in the doorway and looked back at her. Stay here, he said. Lock the door. He was gone before she could answer. She stood in the empty study, in the silence he'd left behind, with her heart in her throat and her hands finally, not quite steady. Someone had just sent a man into her rooms. And Adrian Vale, who had looked her in the eyes on their wedding night and told her that love was not a term in their arrangement, had just crossed a room in 38 days of accumulated restraint and looked at her with an expression that made a liar of everything he'd promised. The question was whether he knew it yet, and whether knowing it would be enough to save either of them from what was already in motion. She locked the door, not because he'd told her to, because it was the rational thing to do, and Elena Marlowe had spent her entire life doing the rational thing in situations designed to make rational thought impossible. She turned the key in the lock and stood with her back to the study door and breathed, 2 counts in, 4 counts out, and made herself look at the room with the same methodical attention she'd applied to everything in this castle since the night she'd arrived. His desk, his documents, spread and weighted at the corners the way someone arranged things when they needed to return to exactly this position. A cup of tea, barely touched, gone cold. The fire burning with the kind of sustained, controlled heat that suggested someone had built it to last. She sat down in his chair, not as a statement, not to claim anything, but because her legs had made a quiet, final decision about what they were willing to support right now. And the chair was there. She sat in Adrian Vale's chair in Adrian Vale's study, with someone's agent currently being detained in her personal rooms, and she made herself think. Lord Cassin. The name had been in the duchy's records she'd spent 6 weeks reading, not prominently, not as a declared enemy, but in the negative space of documents, in the careful way certain trade agreements were worded around his interests, in the conspicuous absence of his family's name from events where his standing should have placed him. A man whose opposition to the Vale Duchy was structural, old, and patient. The kind of opposition that did not announce itself. The kind that sent someone's younger brother into debt, and then, when the debt was resolved, escalated. The man in her rooms had not been looking for valuables. She understood that without being told. People who looked for valuables moved quickly and took things. People who looked for information moved carefully and left no trace. She had been in that suite this morning and nothing had appeared disturbed, which meant either the search had just begun or the man was skilled enough that she hadn't noticed. Both possibilities were worse than the other. She stood when the footsteps reached the door. Not Adrian's, too light, too quick, and had a half-second to recognize the rhythm before the knock came. "Your Grace," the maid's voice. Sela, who had been assigned to her household in the first week and had the particular gift of being useful without being intrusive. "The Duke asks that you remain where you are. He says to tell you it's handled." "Tell the Duke I'd like to know what handled means specifically." A pause. Yes, Your Grace." He came back 40 minutes later. She was standing at the window. Not because there was anything useful to see. The courtyard below was quiet, the morning activity of the household proceeding with deliberate normalcy that suggested someone had given instructions about appearances. But because standing felt better than sitting and the window gave her something to do with her eyes that wasn't staring at the door. The key turned in the lock from the outside. She hadn't considered that he would have a key to his own study, which was obvious in retrospect, which told her something about the state her thinking was in. He came inside and closed the door and looked at her. "Are you hurt?" he said. "I wasn't in my rooms." "I'm aware. I'm asking if you're hurt." The distinction landed somewhere she didn't expect. She shook her head. He absorbed this and moved to his desk and stood there without sitting, his hands braced on the surface, and she could see from 8 feet away that he'd been moving fast. His breathing was controlled but not yet settled. There was a faint tension in his jaw that hadn't been there when he left. "Who was he?" she said. "A man named Dre, minor house retainer to Lord Cassin, registered as a kitchen auxiliary on the staff roster." He looked up. "He's been in this castle for 4 months." 4 months. She'd been here for 5 weeks. He'd been placed before she arrived. "He was waiting for me specifically," she said, "or waiting for a specific kind of access you represented." Adrian straightened. "Cassin doesn't do things simply. He runs contingencies. The debt angle with your brother was one approach. Having someone inside the household was another." "What was he looking for?" A pause. Not a deflecting pause. She'd learned to read the difference. This one was the pause of someone who'd made a decision about how much to say and was revising it. "Correspondence," Adrian said. "Anything that could be used to suggest your loyalty was divided. Letters from your family, documents, personal records." He met her eyes. "Something that could be brought to the Crown's Council as evidence of a compromised duchess and, by extension, a compromised duke." The shape of it assembled in her mind with the grim clarity of something she should have seen sooner. "He doesn't want to destroy you," she said. "He wants to delegitimize you, remove your political standing without open war." "Without open war," Adrian confirmed. "Yes, and I'm the entry point. You were meant to be." The past tense. She filed it. "What happens to Dre?" "He's being held. He'll be questioned. What comes after that depends on what he gives us." The pale eyes stayed level. "He won't be harmed beyond what the questioning requires." "I wasn't going to ask you to do that." "I know." He said it without inflection, but there was something beneath the flatness, a note she'd started to recognize in the last few weeks, the particular frequency of a man who was accounting for the difference between who he'd been and what she seemed to expect. "I wanted you to know it anyway." She looked at him across the study. The morning light was fully established now, coming in gray and even through the north windows, and it laid everything out plainly. The exhaustion under his control, the tightness around his mouth, the way his hands on the desk were not quite resting but braced, as though he needed the solid surface. "You've been tracking Cassine's movements for longer than 4 months," she said. Not a question. He didn't look away. "Yes. And you didn't tell me when I arrived because you weren't a variable yet." He stopped. The sentence had been correct and was also, she could see him realizing it, a specific kind of wrong. "Because I hadn't—" He stopped again. "Because you hadn't decided what I was," she said. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that occurred when something true had been said plainly in a room that wasn't used to plain true things. "Fair," he said. The word came out like it cost him. She asked to see the room. He took her personally, which she hadn't expected. She'd assumed he'd send Rourke or the Chamberlain, but he walked beside her through the corridor with the same deliberate, unhurried pace he brought to everything, and she noticed the staff they passed straightened incrementally at his approach, the household's body language shifting the way a room shifts when a pressure front moves through it. Her suite was undisturbed to the eye. She walked through it slowly while Adrian stood in the doorway, and she looked at everything with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read environments as text. The vanity, the writing desk, the small chest where she kept her personal correspondence. "The chest," she said. "The latch was examined," he said. "He didn't get it open." "How do you know?" "Because I looked at it before you came in." She turned. He was still in the doorway, arms at his sides, watching her move through the room with the expression he'd had in the courtyard this morning. The one she hadn't been able to name and still couldn't quite, like he was doing an accounting she wasn't privy to. "You looked at my correspondence chest," she said. "I checked the latch. I didn't open it." "Why not?" The question seemed to catch him in a way she hadn't intended. He was quiet for a moment. "Because it wasn't mine to open," he said. She held that for a second. In this household, in this marriage where she had been told explicitly that she was a transaction and companionship was not on the table, a man who had every political reason to want to know what was in that chest and the practical authority to open it without asking, had looked at the latch and walked away. She didn't say anything. She walked to the window and looked out at the view she'd had for 5 weeks, the east garden and beyond it the first curve of the estate's boundary wall, and she let the morning sit between them without trying to fill it. "I need to understand Cassine," she said finally. "Everything. The history, the current strategy, the people he's using. If I'm his entry point, I should know what I'm the entry point into." She heard him shift in the doorway. "Elena." It was the first time he'd used her name without the formal address. She noticed this. She kept her eyes on the garden and did not react to it. "That information puts you in a more dangerous position than you're already in," he said. "I'm already in the dangerous position. I'd rather be in it with a map than without one." She turned. "You said I could be useful. This is me being useful. Tell me what you know." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Come back to the study." He talked for 2 hours, not the way he talked to his advisors, clipped, directive, oriented toward outcomes. He talked the way someone talked when they'd been carrying a thing alone for a long time, and the weight had become so familiar they'd stopped noticing it until someone asked. He sat across the desk from her and laid out Lord Cassine's campaign against the Vale Duchy from its beginning, a land dispute 15 years prior, the systematic blocking of trade agreements, the manufactured scandal that had cost Adrian's father 2 critical court alliances in the last year of his life, the current phase which had begun 18 months ago, and which involved building a case, through patient accumulation of circumstance and implication, that Adrian Vale was unfit to hold his title. She asked questions. He answered them. The rhythm of it was unlike anything she'd experienced with him. Not the frozen politeness of the Great Hall, not the careful operational distance of their brief interactions. More like being handed something real and being expected to hold it without dropping it. At one point, she asked about Cassine's relationship with the Crown's Council, and he stopped, and something shifted in his face. "There are members of the Council," he said slowly, "who believe the duchy is better managed under someone less—" he seemed to be selecting the word with care. "Autonomous. Someone Cassine controls. Someone who could be managed, yes.
And you've been fighting this alone. I have advisors. That isn't what I said. Another silence. He looked at the documents on his desk. She watched the line of his jaw. My last campaign for council allies ended with my closest political friend in an arranged accident on the Northern Road, he said. 3 years ago. A beat. So, yes, largely alone. The flatness in his voice when he said it was the flatness of a wound that had long since passed the acute stage and become simply a permanent feature of the landscape. She understood that kind of flatness. She'd spent years cultivating her own version of it. I'm sorry, she said. He looked up. She had the sense that he'd expected something else, a tactical response, a pivot to strategy. Not that. Marcus, he said. His name was Marcus Hale. I'm sorry about Marcus. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. Cassian will move again, he said. Dre's removal will tell him the household approach failed. He'll shift method. How quickly? Days. A week at most. Then we have a week. She leaned forward slightly. What does he need that he doesn't have? What's the missing piece of his case against you? Adrian was quiet for a moment. Evidence of financial misconduct, he said. The trade route expansion I've been planning would give the duchy significantly more independence from the capital's tariff system. There are ways to make that look like evasion rather than strategy, if you frame the documents correctly. And the documents exist. In draft, incomplete, not yet ratified. His eyes sharpened. He couldn't use them as they are. He'd need either the originals altered or something that appeared to be correspondence confirming a deal that doesn't exist. A forgery. A credible one. She sat with that. He doesn't have access to your study, she said, or your correspondence. He was in my rooms looking for... She stopped. He was looking for something written in my hand, something from me that could be presented as evidence of your misconduct, something I might have written not knowing what it would be used for. Adrian went very still. There's a letter, she said. She said it carefully, watching his face. I wrote to my father 3 weeks ago. I mentioned the trade route discussions because your chamberlain briefed me on the duchy's economic priorities, and I was trying to demonstrate to my father that I was involved, establishing myself. She kept her voice flat. I referenced numbers, draft numbers from a document I'd been given as background reading. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Where's the letter? Adrian said. His voice was entirely controlled and entirely different from anything she'd heard from him before. I sent it. Standard post 10 days ago. She met his eyes. It would have passed through the capital's sorting office before reaching my father. If Cassine has someone in the postal system, he does, then he may already have a copy. The study was very quiet. She could hear the fire. She could hear beneath the fire the sound of Adrian Vale's specific and comprehensive stillness. The stillness of a man running the full consequences of a thing and finding the math extremely poor. This is my fault, she said. I didn't know what the numbers meant in context. I wasn't trying to... I know. The 2 words came out rough, like he was cutting through something. I know you weren't. That isn't the problem. No, he agreed. The problem is that we have days, not a week. He stood. The movement was contained, but the energy behind it was not. The kind of controlled velocity that made her understand again why rooms paid attention when he entered them. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she watched the set of his shoulders and waited. There is a way to neutralize the letter, he said. Tell me. He turned. If we have the conversation with the council first, before Cassine can present anything, we can control the framing. Present the trade route plan ourselves, officially, with the appropriate documentation, and the letter becomes corroboration rather than evidence. He paused. But the council session isn't scheduled for another month, and requesting an emergency audience raises its own flags. Unless there's a reason for an emergency audience that isn't about the trade routes. He looked at her. Dre, she said, you're holding a man who was caught searching the Duchess of Valemont's rooms. That's not a minor incident. That's a documented security breach with a named court lord's fingerprints on it. She held his gaze.
That's the reason you call the council, not the trade routes. Cassin, you bring the accusation before he can bring his. Adrian was absolutely still. She watched him think. She'd learned to read the quality of his silences. There were the closed ones, the ones that meant he'd already decided and was choosing whether to share the conclusion. And there were the open ones, where the machinery was actually running, where he was genuinely working through something. This was an open silence. She stayed in it. He'll counter, Adrian said. He'll say the search was an unrelated matter, that Dre acted independently, that there's no direct line to him. There is a direct line. Dre will give it to us. If he talks. He'll talk. She said it with a certainty that surprised her slightly. Because right now he's weighing his loyalty to a lord who burned him by putting him in a position that's gotten him caught, against whatever you're offering him for information. That's not a complicated calculation. Adrian looked at her. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her from the courtyard at dawn. Not the processing assessment she'd become used to, but something more direct, more unguarded, as though he'd stopped for a moment, applying the usual filters. You're better at this than you let on, he said. I've been managing difficult people in impossible situations since I was 12 years old, she said. I simply didn't have a territory this large to practice on before. Something in his face moved. It wasn't quite a smile. She wasn't sure his face did that exactly, with any ease. But it was the shape a face makes when a smile is operating somewhere beneath the surface and hasn't yet found its way out. The council request would need to go out today, he said. Then send it today. He held her gaze for one more moment. All right, he said. It was the second plain, direct thing he'd said to her that morning, and like the first one, it was such a clean departure from everything she'd built herself to expect from him that she had no immediate response. She just stood with it, let it sit, told herself it was strategy, that it was two people with converging interests making a sensible decision, that the particular warmth sitting in her chest right now was the warmth of competence recognized rather than anything more complicated. She was, she reflected, becoming less convincing to herself. The council request went out before noon. The staff moved with the particular heightened efficiency of people who understood that the household was on a footing they hadn't been on for some time, and Elena moved through the afternoon in her sitting room with the duchy's political record spread around her, building the map she should have had weeks ago. The alliances, the pressure points, the specific members of the council who owed Adrian and the ones who owed Cassin, and the ones who were simply watching to see which direction the wind settled. At 4 o'clock, Rourke knocked and came in without waiting, which told her that whatever he carried had been pre-authorized. Dre talked, he said. He had the clipped delivery of a military man who had learned long ago that preamble was an indulgence. Cassin has 3 additional people inside the castle. We've identified 2. She felt the cold move through her like water. The third, she said, unknown. Could be household, could be court. Could be someone I interact with regularly. Could be, Rourke said. He had the grace not to soften it. She looked at him. He was a man who looked like he'd been around long enough to see most things once, and a few things twice, and had made his peace with the landscape. She had the sense that he was running his own assessment of her, as he'd probably been running since she arrived, and that today was changing some variable in the calculation. The Duke, she said. Does he know yet? He sent me to brief you first. She held that for a second. Tell him I'd like to meet tonight, she said. Both of us, together, with whoever he trusts in this building. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Rourke studied her for a moment. Yes, Your Grace, he said. He left. She turned back to her documents and sat with her hands flat on the table and let herself feel, briefly and without indulgence, the weight of what was true. There was a person in this castle she hadn't identified yet. There were people who wanted to use her to unmake her husband, a man she'd married as a transaction and spent 38 days discovering was something considerably more difficult to be indifferent to than she'd planned. And she had just sent the guard captain to ask for a meeting that Adrian Vale had effectively already offered by briefing her first. She thought about that, about what it meant for a man who had stood in her doorway on their wedding night and excised the possibility of partnership with the same precise efficiency he excised everything else from his life, to spend a crisis morning briefing his bride before his own guard captain. She thought about the way he'd looked at her in the study. The open silence. You're better at this than you let on. She thought about how thoroughly she'd been lying to herself about what she was building in the space between counting and cataloging and surviving. The door at the end of the corridor opened. She heard it, couldn't see it from here. The sitting room was around the corner from the main passage, but she knew the particular weight of his footsteps after 38 days of mapping them. And she knew that he wasn't going to his study or the Great Hall or any of his usual routes. He was coming here. He knocked once and opened the door without waiting and stood in the frame with his coat still on from wherever he'd come from, his face set back into the familiar control, but his eyes going immediately to her like they'd been doing, she now understood, for longer than she'd registered.
"You've heard," he said. "Yes. There's a third person." "I know." He came inside. He didn't sit. He stood near her work table and looked at the documents she'd spread. The political records, the council alliances, the notes she'd been making in her precise, small handwriting. And then he looked at her. "Tonight," he said, "you, me, Rourke, and 2 of my advisors whose loyalty I can document 6 ways. We map everything we have and we decide how to use it." "Yes," she said, "and tomorrow morning the council request. We'll have their answers, whatever form they come in." He looked at her for another moment, that open, unguarded look she'd only seen twice before and was beginning to believe was the most honest thing on his face. "Elena." The name again. No formal address. "When this is over," the window exploded inward. The sound was enormous and instantaneous, and she was on the floor before she consciously decided to move. Some version of her that was older than thought and faster than fear had simply dropped, and the cold air was pouring through the broken glass, and Adrian was crouched over her, his body between hers and the window, and in the split second of ringing silence that followed the impact, she looked past his shoulder at the thing that had come through the glass. Not a rock, not a thrown object, an arrow embedded in the far wall, and wrapped around the shaft, secured with a black cord, was a piece of paper. She heard Adrian's breathing. She felt his hand on her shoulder, steadying, pressing down, keeping her down. And she felt the exact moment it happened. The shift in the quality of his grip from reflexive to deliberate. The choice to keep holding on. She looked at his face, 6 inches from hers, and found something there she hadn't seen on him before. Not fury this time. Not the measured cold of a man who had survived by feeling nothing. Fear. Not for himself. She understood, in the loud, ringing silence of the destroyed window, that Adrian Vale had just discovered something he thought he'd permanently removed from his emotional range. That the man who had stood in her doorway on their wedding night and sealed love out of the arrangement with such precise, practiced certainty had spent 38 days losing a battle he hadn't realized he was fighting. He knew it too. She could see it in his face. The recognition, rapid and unwelcome, that something had gotten through the walls without his permission, and that it had gotten through far enough that someone throwing a threat through her window had just produced the one reaction he had sworn, with great conviction, he was no longer capable of. He reached past her and picked up the arrow without moving from his position covering her. He looked at the note. His jaw went tight. She said, "What does it say?" He didn't answer immediately. "Adrian." The name in her mouth felt significant. She said it anyway. "What does it say?" He looked at her. Whatever was on the paper had produced the specific expression of a man who had just had a door closed behind him with no handle on the inside. "It says," he said very carefully, "that if I proceed with the council meeting, they have enough to take you from me." The last 2 words landed in the silence between them like stones dropped into still water. "Take you from me. Not from the duchy. Not from the arrangement. From me." He'd said it, and they both heard it, and neither of them pretended they hadn't. Outside, the guards were already moving. Inside, they were in the wreckage of a window, on the floor of her sitting room, with his hand still on her shoulder, and a new and irreversible thing sitting between them that had no tactical solution and no managed distance and no procedure for being handled at all. The line was gone. They were already on the other side of it. He stood up first, not because the danger had passed. The guards in the corridor made that clear enough, their voices clipped and urgent through the wall, but because staying on the floor with his hand on her shoulder,
and those 3 words hanging in the air between them was a position he didn't have a protocol for. Adrian Vale had protocols for most things. He had built them specifically so that the space between himself and the rest of the world remained navigable, measurable, controlled. The floor of Elena's sitting room, with broken glass catching the afternoon light and a note wrapped around an arrow that had just said "Take you from me" in his own internal voice, was not navigable. He stood. He offered her his hand. She took it. He pulled her up and let go immediately, which was the right thing to do, and which felt like the wrong thing to do, and he filed that feeling in the same place he'd been filing an increasing number of feelings over the past 5 weeks. The locked cabinet in the back of his mind that he'd been telling himself he'd deal with later. Later was becoming a structural problem. "You need to move to a different room," he said. "Tonight, and until we know the 3rd person. I'm not hiding in my own house. You're relocating within your own house. There's a difference." She looked at him with the particular expression she'd developed, or perhaps had always had, and he'd only recently learned to read, that said she was deciding how hard to push. She pushed. "If I relocate, whoever this is knows the arrow landed, knows I'm rattled." Her jaw was set. "I stay in this room. We board the window and I stay." He looked at her for a moment. "Fine," he said. Rourke appeared in the doorway, took in the scene with the rapid efficiency of a man for whom broken glass and embedded arrows were a professional context rather than a shock, and said, "I've got people on the exterior wall. Arrow came from the east garden, which means someone was inside the perimeter." "Or someone who knew the guard rotation," Adrian said. Rourke's face did something. "The rotation changed this morning," he said. "I changed it myself at 6 o'clock. "Who knew about the change?" "Me, you, and the 3 captains." A pause. "And Hess. He does the scheduling records." Hess, the castle's senior steward, a man who had been in service to the Vale household for 11 years, who had managed the domestic operations of Valemont with the precise, undemonstrative competence of someone who took genuine professional pride in invisibility. A man Adrian had trusted so completely that he'd stopped actively trusting him, the way you stop thinking about gravity. It was simply a condition of existence, not a choice you renewed daily. The locked cabinet cracked open slightly. "Find Hess," Adrian said. "Don't move him yet. I want to know where he goes." Chat. The meeting happened at 8 o'clock in the study, with the shutters closed and the fire built high, and the 5 people in the room constituting the entirety of what Adrian was certain about. Himself, Elena, Rourke, his senior legal advisor Marin, a woman of 50 who had outlasted 2 administrations by being smarter than the men around her and careful enough never to say so too plainly, and his financial secretary, a quiet man named Pell, who knew the duchy's accounts well enough to reconstruct a forgery from memory. Marin laid it out. The council request had been received. 3 members had already responded with confirmations, which was faster than protocol required and suggested they'd been expecting it. The session was set for 4 days out, in the capital, requiring Adrian's presence, and, this was new, Marin delivered it with the flat precision of someone who'd learned to give bad news without apology. Elena's. Her presence was specifically requested, Marin said. "By whom?" Adrian said. The request came through the council secretary, unsigned. Elena, across the table, was absolutely still. "They want me there so they can question me about the letter." "Or present you as evidence without giving you the chance to speak," Marin said. "Depending on how the session is framed before you arrive." "Then we frame it first," Elena said. "We submit a full account of the letter, its contents, its context, the fact that it was written without knowledge of the number's sensitivity, before the session opens. We take the narrative away from them before they can use it." Marin looked at her. "That requires the Duke to formally acknowledge that his wife was briefed on sensitive trade discussions within weeks of her arrival." "Which is true," Elena said, "and which demonstrates engagement rather than incompetence if it's framed correctly. It also gives Cassine's allies grounds to argue that the Duchess was given access she shouldn't have had. The alternative is walking into that session without an established account and letting them construct one for us." Elena's voice was even and hard. "I'll take the fight we choose over the fight they hand us." Marin looked at Adrian. He'd been watching Elena. He'd been watching her since the window shattered, the way she'd gotten off the floor and shaken glass from her sleeve and started thinking, the way she sat now at his table among his people and argued positions with the focused, undecorated confidence of someone who had always understood strategy but had never before had a table to sit at. He'd been watching her and cataloging, with the part of him that was honest enough to keep an accurate count, how far past the point of no return he already was. "Do it," he said to Marin. "Draft the pre-submission tonight." At 11 o'clock, Rourke knocked on the study door. Hess had visited 3 locations after the evening meal: the kitchens, the linen storage on the second floor, and the castle's east receiving room, which was used for minor diplomatic meetings and was otherwise unoccupied. In the east receiving room, he had spent 14 minutes and had left carrying nothing visible. Rourke's man had been close enough to hear voices, 2 of them. "The second voice," Adrian said, "couldn't identify it. Male, upper register, accent from the capital." Cassine's man was still in the building, which meant Dre had given them names but not all the names. Which meant Dre had been strategic about what he offered, enough to seem cooperative, not enough to expose the full network. A man working in layers, buying time. Adrian looked at the fire. He'd trusted Hess for 11 years. He'd trusted him in the specific way you trust load-bearing walls. Without thinking about it, because the whole structure depended on them holding, and the structure had held. He'd given Hess access to the guard rotations because the steward managed household scheduling, and the 2 systems overlapped, and it had never been a point of concern. It was a point of concern now. The thing about trust, he understood in the specific and humbling way you understood things only when they broke. The thing about trust was that it was most dangerous precisely where it was most complete. You fortified the borders you were uncertain about. You left the interior unguarded because you'd already made the decision about the interior years ago and moved on. Cassine had understood this, had probably understood it better than Adrian had understood his own household. That was the lesson written in Hess's 14 minutes in the East receiving room. The most expensive vulnerabilities were the ones you'd stopped checking because you'd decided they weren't vulnerabilities at all. "Don't touch him yet," Adrian said. "If we move on Hess before the session, Cassine knows we've found the line. He'll shift." He paused. "We use him. Let him keep reporting, but we control what he has to report." Rourke nodded. He understood operational thinking. "What do we feed him?" "I need to think about that." Adrian looked at the closed shutters over the window. "Tonight, I need to think, Yank." He found Elena in the corridor at midnight. She was coming from the direction of the east staircase, which was the back route she used when she wanted to avoid the main passage. And she was carrying a candle and wearing a heavy robe over her nightgown, and her hair was down, and she stopped when she saw him with the expression of someone caught doing something they'd prefer not to explain. "I couldn't sleep," she said, before he could ask. "Neither could I." They stood in the corridor for a moment in the way that had been happening between them more frequently. The accidental proximity that produced a silence neither of them filled immediately, because filling it required choosing a register, and neither of them was certain anymore which register was honest. "Walk with me," he said. She fell into step beside him. He didn't have a destination. He knew the castle well enough in the dark to move through it without a candle. He'd done it enough times in the years after his first wife died, when sleep was something that happened to other people, and the only thing that helped was movement. He walked the western corridor and down the back stairs and through the ground floor passage that ran behind the kitchens, and Elena walked beside him with her candle casting a small warm circle around them both. And for a while neither of them spoke, and the silence was the good kind, the kind that didn't require anything. "Tell me about Marcus," she said. He hadn't expected that. He looked at her in the candlelight. "You said his name this morning," she said. "You don't have to. But I thought, if you wanted to." He walked for a moment longer. "We grew up together," he said. His family's estate bordered the duchy's northern edge. He was the opposite of me in most of the ways that matter. Loud, optimistic, found everything funny that I found infuriating. He paused. He was the only person who knew what the duchy's financial situation actually was before my father died. The only person I told. And he died on the northern road. 3 months after I told him.
His voice was completely flat. The accident was well constructed, a wheel failure on a bad curve. Nothing that couldn't happen to anyone traveling at night. But it happened to him specifically. At the time, I couldn't prove it. He stopped walking. They were in the passage near the old east storage, unused, dusty, far from the household's active corridors. I couldn't prove it, and I couldn't shake it, and what I did with that over the years after was… He stopped again. Become someone who didn't give anyone else that kind of access, she said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. She held the candle between them and looked at him with those clear, level eyes that had spent 6 weeks reading him more accurately than anyone had in years, and she said, I'm not going to die on the northern road, Adrian. I know, he said. You don't know that. No, he agreed. I don't know that. The honesty of it sat between them. He didn't dress it up. She didn't ask him to. But I'm still here, she said. Tonight, for whatever that's worth to your accounting. He looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight. It's worth more than you know, he said. And that's the problem. She didn't look away. He didn't look away. And the thing that had been building since the arrow came through the window, since this morning in the study, since 6 weeks of accidental proximity and careful mapping and the quiet accumulation of a person mattering, sat between them in the dark corridor like a fire someone had started without permission, burning regardless of whether it was wanted. He said, Elena. The candle went out. Not the wind. The passage was enclosed. It went out the way candles go out when something moves quickly past them, and in the sudden total dark, Adrian reached for her on pure instinct, and his hand found her arm and pulled her back against the wall, and he heard it, footsteps, 2 sets, coming from the east storage. He pressed her flat against the stones and put himself between her and the direction of the sound and stayed absolutely still. The voices were low. He caught fragments. Session, documents, the wife. And then a word that cut through everything else like cold water. Rourke. He went still in a different way. The footsteps moved away, past the intersecting corridor, faded. He stood in the dark with Elena pressed against the wall behind him, and her breath on the back of his neck, and the word reverberating in his chest like a struck bell. Rourke, his guard captain, 15 years, a man who had bled for him on 3 different occasions, a man whose scarred face and clipped delivery had been the most reliable constant of his adult life. More reliable than the household, more reliable than the court, more reliable than almost anything he could name. The thing about load-bearing walls was that when they failed, they took everything above them with them. He stepped back from the wall. His hand was still on Elena's arm. He didn't remove it immediately. You heard, he said. Barely sound. Yes, she said. Barely sound. Don't say his name. Not here. I know. They stood in the ruined dark of the passage, and Adrian Vale felt, for the first time in years, the specific vertigo of a man whose map of the world had just been redrawn. Not Hess, or not only Hess. Hess was a piece, a point of information, a rotatable part. This was the architecture itself coming apart. This was the floor. He had built everything on what he was certain about. He had constructed his entire operational life around the principle of knowing who was load-bearing and refusing to place anything valuable over the places that weren't. And Rourke had been load-bearing, had been, functionally, the cornerstone. The thing that came up in him now was not grief. He would not call it grief. What it was the cold, total clarity of a man who has been hit hard enough that the pain hasn't reached him yet, and in the space before it does, he is capable of thinking with a terrifying purity. They had 4 days before the council session. Rourke knew that. Rourke knew the pre-submission Marin was drafting. Rourke knew the plan to use Hess as a controlled information channel. Rourke knew all of it, because Adrian had held the meeting tonight with the 5 people he was certain about. He had been wrong about one of them, which meant Casson already had everything. The council session was not a proceeding they were walking into. It was a trap they had 4 days to recognize before they stepped into it. He moved in the dark, found Elena's hand, pulled her back the way they'd come with the controlled urgency of someone who needed to move without appearing to run. We have to get back to the study, he said. Now! All of it's compromised, she said. Quiet, fast, keeping pace with him. Everything we discussed tonight. Yes. Then we don't go to the council session. We can't avoid it. A duke who doesn't answer a council summons, we go, but we don't go with anything they're expecting us to bring. She was thinking out loud. He could hear it. The same rapid internal accounting he ran himself. The same refusal to fold. We need a different play entirely. Something built on what they don't know yet. They don't know we heard them. No. She pulled him to a stop at the base of the main staircase. Her face was invisible in the dark, but her voice was absolutely clear. And they don't know about Dre's full testimony. What exactly did Dre give us? Not the edited version for the room, everything. He looked at her in the dark. The full testimony. He'd shared a summary with the meeting, operational, relevant, the specifics he'd kept with Pell and Marin alone, because even in the room he'd trusted that night, he'd maintained one layer of compartment. Old habit. The habit of a man who had learned that the most important information lived in the smallest box. Dre gave us a correspondence chain, he said. Documented. 3 months of communication between Cassine's factor and an insider in this castle. The insider isn't named in the chain. It uses a symbol, a mark. A mark that could be matched to something physical. If we had the physical object to match it to. Do we? A pause. Marin has been trying to identify it, he said. She hasn't yet. Elena was quiet for a moment. What does the mark look like, she said. He described it. 8 seconds of silence. I've seen that mark, she said. His heart did something that was not physiologically straightforward. Where? He said. On a ring, she said. A signet ring. I noticed it because the design was unusual. It didn't match any of the standard house marks I'd been studying. I thought it was simply old family design. She paused. I saw it 3 days ago. On whose hand? Another pause. Longer this time. The kind of pause that preceded something that could not be unsaid once it was said, that would take a shape in the room and stay there regardless of what came after. Marin, she said. It was on Marin's hand. The word dropped into the dark, and the dark absorbed it, and what expanded in the silence afterward was not surprise. Adrian's system had already moved past surprise, had moved into the cold mechanical territory where betrayal became simply data. But something older and more personal than data, something that lived in the body rather than the mind, that recognized the pattern of this specific damage with the exhausted familiarity of a man who had been through it before. Not Marcus this time. Not a friend taken by a staged accident. This time it was the woman who had drafted legal arguments in his defense for 11 years, who had, just hours ago, sat at his table and given him strategic advice about how to survive a council session, who had taken everything he'd shared in that room tonight and had a name and a ring that connected her directly to the man trying to unmake him. He stood at the bottom of his own staircase in the dark and understood, with the specific clarity of someone who had just had the last load-bearing wall pulled out, that he had 4 days, no functioning inner circle, a council session that was built to destroy him, and one person left whose loyalty he would wager his life on. He looked at where Elena was in the dark. He couldn't see her face. He found her hand. She gripped back. All right, he said. His voice was quiet and entirely stripped of anything except what it was. It's just us. And the thing that came into her grip in response. Not softer, not uncertain, but harder, steadier, the specific quality of a person who had spent 22 years learning to be the thing that held when everything else let go, told him, with the clarity of something true, that he had not miscalculated where he placed the last of his weight. But the walls of Valemont were already closing in, and Marin, somewhere above them in the castle she'd helped hollow out, was not yet aware that 2 people in the dark at the bottom of a staircase had just become the most dangerous thing in her world. They moved fast, and they moved quiet, and they did not light another candle. Adrian knew the castle in the dark the way he knew it in daylight. Better, maybe, because darkness stripped everything to structure, and he had always understood structure more fluently than surface. He pulled Elena through the ground passage, up the servant's stair, into the study through the side door that most of the household didn't know existed, and he turned the interior bolt
and stood in the firelit dark of his own room and let himself breathe for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was what he allowed. Then he moved to the desk. "Pell," he said. "I need Pell. He's the only one left who wasn't in that room tonight," Elena finished. She was already at the writing table, pulling paper. "What do you need him to do?" "The correspondence chain Dre gave us. Pell has the original copies locked in the financial annex. If Marin hasn't gotten to them yet..." "She doesn't know we know." Elena looked up. "She thinks tonight's meeting went cleanly. She thinks she gave us strategy and walked out carrying everything we discussed. Which means she reports to Cassin tonight. Which means by morning, he adjusts. So we have until morning." He looked at her across the desk in the firelight. The candlelight was gone, but the fire was enough. Enough to see the set of her jaw, the absolute absence of panic in her face. The specific quality of a person who had survived enough genuine difficulty that crisis had become, if not comfortable, then at least navigable. She told him once that she'd been managing impossible situations since she was 12. He was watching what 12 years of that training produced, and he understood with a clarity that was neither convenient nor deniable, the most formidable thing he'd encountered in a very long time. He crossed to the door. "I'll get Pell. I'll write the alternate submission." She was already writing. "Not the one Marin drafted, a new one, built around Dre's testimony and the mark on the ring. Cassin doesn't know we have the chain connected to Marin yet. That's the one piece he can't have anticipated." He stopped at the door. "Elena." She looked up. "If Rourke finds out we're moving tonight, then we move faster than Rourke," she said. "Go," Dart said. Pell was a small, precise man who slept lightly and came awake without disorientation, which Adrian had never specifically valued until right now. He was at the financial annex door inside 4 minutes of being knocked out of bed, in his nightclothes with a lamp, squinting at Adrian's face and reading whatever was there with the rapid competence of a man who processed numbers for a living and understood that the variables had changed. "The correspondence chain," Adrian said. "Dre's documents. Are they where I left them?" "Filed under the secondary seal. I checked them at 6 this evening." Pell was already inside, moving to the cabinet. "What happened?" "Marin." Pell stopped moving for exactly 1 second. Then he continued to the cabinet without comment, which told Adrian more about Pell's acuity than any verbal response would have. The man had done the math on Marin before now, had probably done it and said nothing because saying it required certainty he didn't yet have. The files were intact. Adrian took them under his arm and looked at Pell. "I need you to come to the study," he said. "I need you to cross-reference the mark on the correspondence chain with the duchy's official seal registry. You have access to that." "I built the registry." "Then tell me if the mark matches anything in it." Pell was already putting on his coat. The study at 2 in the morning had the quality of a room that had decided to be useful. Elena had commandeered the main desk and spread paper across it in the organized chaos of someone thinking faster than they could write. And when Adrian came back with Pell, she looked up and said, "I need the chain dates, specifically any communication from the last 3 months." Pell sat across from her and began laying documents without being asked to explain himself, which was the correct instinct. Adrian watched the two of them work, Pell's methodical precision and Elena's rapid synthesis operating in a rhythm they'd never established before and had apparently found immediately anyway, and made himself think about Rourke. He'd known Rourke for 15 years. He'd trusted Rourke the way he'd trusted his own right hand, not as a choice he made daily, but as an operational truth he'd stopped examining. And now he stood in the firelit study running the backward calculation. Every piece of information Rourke had carried, every patrol route, every security adjustment, every conversation conducted in front of him without reservation, and the sum of it was catastrophic. Cassin hadn't needed a spy in the study. He'd had a spy at Adrian's shoulder for the better part of a decade. The thing that came up in him was not the grief he'd expected. It was something colder than grief. A man who has been betrayed before learns to process it faster. And what Adrian felt now was the specific, stripped-down clarity of someone who has already been through the worst version of this and knows exactly what it costs and is choosing, deliberately and without illusion, to pay it again rather than stop. That was what people got wrong about men who kept moving through damage. They assumed it meant the damage didn't register. It registered, every time. But the alternative, stop moving, stop building, stop trusting anything, had a cost too. And Adrian had lived that cost for 3 years after Marcus died, had lived it in the frozen efficiency of a life from which he'd excised everything that could be taken, and what it had produced was a castle that ran like a machine and felt like a tomb. He was done with the tomb. "Here," Pell said. He laid a single document beside Elena's papers. The mark matches a secondary seal registered to the duchy's legal office. Established 9 years ago. He looked at Adrian. "The year Marin joined your household." Elena picked up the document. "Read it. Put it down." "She built herself in from the start," she said. "Patient," Adrian said. The word came out like gravel. "Cassine's always been patient." "Not patient enough." Elena looked at him. "This document is the direct chain. Marin's seal on Cassine's correspondence. This isn't implication anymore. This is evidence that can be presented to the council directly, regardless of what Cassine brings." "If we get to the council session," Adrian said. The fire shifted. Both of them understood what that meant. They had 4 days to the session. Marin would report to Cassine before dawn. Cassine would understand from the report that his trap was set and his principals were in position. What he would not understand yet was that his chain had been exposed. But the moment he received Marin's report and compared it against anything the watch captain passed along, the discrepancy would surface. And Cassine was not a man who left discrepancies unaddressed. They weren't going to have 4 days. "He'll move before the session," Adrian said. "He'll move tomorrow." "To do what?" Elena said. "Take the option off the table." Adrian's voice was flat. "If I don't make it to the session, the council addresses the duchy in my absence. With Marin's forged documents and no rebuttal, the duchy's governance shifts to provisional council control pending review. Cassine has 3 council members in his pocket. 3 is enough for provisional control." The room was very quiet. "He'll move against you directly," she said. "Yes." She held his gaze. "And against me." He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. The arrow through the window had already answered it. She straightened her spine. "Then we don't wait for him to move. We move first." Osank. By 3 in the morning, they had a plan. It was not a comfortable plan. It required moving on Marin and Rourke simultaneously, before either could communicate, using a guard rotation that Adrian rebuilt from scratch with Pell's help, selecting 4 men personally, going down the roster based on tenure, regional origin, financial record, every cross-reference available, and it required doing this quietly enough that the castle's normal overnight activity didn't alert the people they were moving against. It also required Elena to play a specific role that Adrian spent 20 minutes not wanting to ask her to play. "You're going to tell me not to do it," she said. "I'm going to tell you it puts you in the direct path of—" "I'm already in the direct path. The arrow came through my window." She met his eyes without flinching. "If we do this your way, Marin is surprised in her room in the middle of the night by you and 4 guards. And she knows immediately that everything collapsed. She has time to claim coercion, unauthorized search, abuse of authority." Elena paused. "But if she receives an urgent message from the Duchess at 3 in the morning, a message requesting her counsel privately, using exactly the language from tonight's meeting, she comes to me thinking she still has the advantage, and she walks into whatever you have waiting." He looked at her. "I've been used as a lever in other people's games my entire life," Elena said, and her voice was not bitter exactly, but it was direct in the way that things were direct when they'd been examined honestly, rather than felt dramatically. "I'd like to use myself for once." He exhaled. "Stay in the sitting room," he said. "Door open. 4 men in the corridor where she can't see them until she's inside." "Yes." "And Elena." He stopped. Said it plainly because there was no point anymore in managing the distance. "If anything goes wrong, if she comes with someone, if it moves faster than it should, you don't try to manage it. You get out of the room." She looked at him with those clear eyes. "Likewise," she said. "Yes." Marin came. She came at 3:40 in the morning in a dark robe with her gray hair loose and her face arranged in the concerned maternal expression she'd probably constructed for exactly this kind of late-night emergency. And she walked into Elena's sitting room saying, "Your Grace, your message sounded urgent. What's happened?" and stopped. Elena was sitting at the table with the correspondence chain spread out in front of her. The mark was clearly visible. The silence lasted 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, Elena watched something happen to Marin's face that was almost instructive. The social mask did not crack so much as it simply became insufficient for the load it was carrying, and what came through the insufficiency was not guilt, which Elena had half expected, but calculation. Raw, rapid, entirely unsentimental calculation. A woman who had survived 11 years of this game, assessing her current position and running options. "Sit down," Elena said. "I think there's been a—" "Sit down, Marin." Marin sat. "The seal," Elena said. She put her finger on the mark. 9 years. You've been in this household 9 years. You registered this seal in the duchy's legal office in your first month. She looked up. "That's not opportunism. That's architecture. You came here already working for him." Marin's hands were flat on the table. Her face had settled back into something controlled. "You're a young woman who has been in this duchy for 6 weeks. You should be very careful about what you think you understand." "I understand the correspondence chain," Elena said. "I understand that it runs directly from Cassin's factor to a mark that matches your registered seal. I understand that you drafted a council submission tonight that would have walked the Duke into a prepared ambush." She paused. "What I don't yet understand is why. Not the politics, that I can map. The personal reason. You've worked for him for 11 years. What did Cassin offer you that 11 years of Adrian Vale's trust wasn't worth?" Something moved through Marin's face. For the first time, it was not calculated. "His trust," she said, and the flatness in her voice was the flatness of an old, specific wound. "You want to know what that trust was worth. Ask him what happened to the legal petition I brought to him 4 years ago. The one that would have expanded the duchy's judicial authority and given this office actual standing rather than advisory function. Ask him what he said when I spent 3 months building that case." She paused. "He didn't read it. He had Rourke file it. He told me it wasn't the priority." The room was very quiet. "Cassin read it," Marin said. "Cassin told me it was the most sophisticated legal argument he'd seen in a decade, and then he told me what it would be worth to the right administration." Her voice was completely level. "So yes, I made a choice. I made it with open eyes, and I would make it again." Adrian came through the door. He'd been in the corridor. Elena hadn't known exactly when he'd arrive. They hadn't scripted it down to the second, because some things couldn't be scripted. But she'd known he was there, had felt the quality of the silence on the other side of the door, and she watched him now cross the room and stand at the table with the 4 men visible in the doorway behind him, and she watched Marin look at his face. Whatever Marin saw there was enough to close down the last of her options. She sat very still. "A petition," he said. His voice was something she'd never heard from him. Not cold, not operational, raw. "You burned down 11 years over a petition I didn't read." "You burned it down," Marin said. "I only chose who to stand with afterward." The silence that followed was the kind that contained multitudes and resolved none of them. Elena watched Adrian look at Marin with the specific expression of a man who is absorbing not just the betrayal, but the specific shape of his own contribution to it, the thing he did or failed to do that provided the opening, and she recognized the expression because she'd worn it herself. The particular accountability of someone honest enough to look at the damage they didn't intend and didn't excuse. "Take her," he said. The 4 men moved. He stood at the table after Marin was gone and looked at the correspondence chain for a moment. Then he looked at Elena. "Rourke," she said, "being held in the East Barracks. 2 of my 4 got to him 20 minutes ago." He exhaled. He didn't resist. "What does that mean?" "It means he knew it was coming." Something crossed his face that she couldn't name. Rourke always knew when the play ran out. Okay. The dawn came gray and fast. Adrian sent the council submission, the real one, built on Dre's testimony and Marin's sealed correspondence, via a rider who left before the household stirred. carrying documents that represented the most comprehensive legal evidence against Cassin that the duchy had assembled in a decade. He sent it with 3 men and instructions not to stop for anything. And then, because Cassin was not a man who waited to see if the rider arrived, the attack came at first light. Not soldiers. Cassin was too careful for open military aggression against a duke on his own land. What came was a legal writ, delivered by a council courier with the weight of 3 signed council endorsements, demanding that Adrian Vale present himself at the capital within 12 hours or face provisional removal pending investigation. The investigation, the writ stated, concerned allegations of financial misconduct specific to the trade route documents, which Cassin's submission, filed that morning, racing Adrian's own submission to the council table, had characterized as evidence of deliberate fraud against Crown Tariff Authority. Adrian read the writ in the courtyard with the courier standing at attention and the early morning light coming flat and cold across the stone, and he understood in the precise, exhausted clarity of someone who had been awake all night doing exactly this math that Cassin had moved the session up, that the 4 days had been cover, that the real timeline had always been this morning, before Adrian could build a countercase, before anything could be established, while the duchy was still running on a compromised inner circle. He handed the writ to Pell. He looked at the courier. "Tell the council I'll present myself within the required window," he said. The courier left. Adrian stood in the courtyard. 12 hours to the capital. 2 hours to prepare. He had Pell, he had Elena, he had 4 guards he'd personally vouched, and a stack of documents that made a strong case if the council was willing to hear it. What he didn't have was the 3 council members already in Cassin's pocket, who would vote to move immediately to provisional measures before the case could be heard, using procedural authority to close the door before the evidence walked through it. He needed a 4th council member, someone not yet committed, someone who could be persuaded in the next 2 hours to hold the procedural vote long enough for the evidence to reach the table. He was still running the calculation when he heard her behind him. "Lady Hartwell," Elena said. He turned. She was standing in the courtyard entrance with her cloak already on and her hair up and the correspondence documents under her arm, and she said it again. "The Countess Hartwell. She's been on the council for 20 years and she's never voted in Cassin's bloc. She told me on my first night here that I was braver than I looked, which was a warning, and possibly something more than a warning." Elena met his eyes. "She has a house in the capital. If we ride now, we reach her before the session opens. And if she agrees to hold the procedural vote, even by 30 minutes, that's enough time for our submission to reach the council floor." He looked at her. He thought about the courtyard at dawn. He thought about a corridor in the dark and a hand gripping back. He thought about a woman who had walked into his life as a transaction and had spent 6 weeks becoming the one variable he hadn't accounted for, the one weight he hadn't planned to carry, and had discovered was the only thing making the whole structure feel like it was worth building in the first place. He thought about what it cost to let someone matter. He knew exactly what it cost. He had the invoices. He paid them anyway. "Ride with me," he said. Not an order, not a strategic deployment of an asset, an ask. She looked at him for a single, clear moment. "I've been waiting for you to say that," she said. They were moving for the stables when the second courier arrived. Not from the council this time, bearing a personal seal Adrian didn't recognize, until Pell grabbed his arm and said, voice stripped to nothing, "That's Cassin's private mark, not the council seal, his personal mark." Adrian took the letter. He broke the seal, read 4 lines. The ground did not move. He had very good balance. But something in the quality of his stillness changed in a way that Elena registered immediately, because she was watching him, because she had learned to read the language of his body with the fluency of someone who had paid close attention to every lesson. "What does it say?" she said. He looked up from the letter. His face was the face of a man who has just been told exactly how far his enemy was willing to go, and who is absorbing the full dimension of that information with the kind of controlled, focused fury that does not raise its voice because it does not need to. "He has Thomas," Adrian said. Elena went very still. "Your brother arrived in the capital yesterday evening. Cassin's people met him at the gate." Adrian looked at her directly. The letter says that if I appear before the council with anything other than a formal withdrawal of the duchy's trade route plans and a signed acknowledgement of the fraud allegations, Thomas Marlowe will be presented to the Crown's court as a co-conspirator in the scheme. The morning was cold and completely quiet around them. Thomas, who had come to the castle 6 weeks ago smelling of travel and borrowed courage, who had gone to Adrian behind her back and been handled and sent home and had, she understood now, with the specific sick clarity of a consequence finally completing its arc, been watched every step of the way. A piece on Cassine's board long before either of them understood the board's dimensions. "He's not a co-conspirator," she said. Her voice was steady. "There was no scheme. He doesn't know anything." "That won't matter in Cassine's court presentation," Adrian said. "He'll have documents. Cassine always has documents." She looked at him. She looked at the man she'd married as a transaction and spent 6 weeks discovering was the specific architecture of someone she would, given a different set of circumstances and considerably more time, love. She looked at him and understood what he was about to say, that they had to choose, that Thomas or the duchy was the decision in front of them, that there was no play that saved both, that this was what Cassine had always been building toward. Not the legal case, not the forgeries, not the moles in the household. This specific moment where the choice between personal and political would crack Adrian's case open from the inside, because Adrian Vale, who had built his entire existence around the principle of protecting himself from exactly this, had a weakness now that Cassine had correctly identified. She was the weakness. Her family was the weakness. And Adrian was looking at her with an expression that told her, plainly, that he already knew this and had already made his decision and was about to tell her something she was not going to accept. "Don't," she said. "Elena, don't you dare tell me you're withdrawing. There's a path where Thomas gets out of this without... There's a path where you walk into that council session and burn Cassine to the ground with everything we have, and then we get Thomas out," she said. Her voice was not raised. It was, if anything, quieter than usual and considerably more dangerous. "That is the path. Do you hear me? If it doesn't work, it will work. You can't know." "I know," she said, "that you have spent 15 years letting people you trust become weapons used against you, and every time it happens you conclude that the answer is to carry less, to need less, to make yourself smaller so there's less surface for the damage to land on." She stepped toward him. "I'm not going to stand in front of Valemont Castle and watch you make yourself smaller for Cassine. Not now, not after everything." He looked at her. The morning light was fully up. The courtyard around them was empty except for Pell at a careful distance, and the horses already saddled and the weight of a decision that had 12 hours to be made and no good options, and one person who believed, with a specificity that was not optimism, but something harder and more durable than optimism, that they could make it through. He was a man who had stopped believing in that particular thing 3 years ago. She was offering it back. "We ride," he said. His voice was rough at the edges in a way it hadn't been before, as though something that had been very carefully maintained had finally given way along one seam, and what came through the seam was not weakness. It was the sound of a man deciding to be something other than invulnerable, to stop treating survival as the ceiling and start treating it as the floor. They moved for the horses. And somewhere in the capital, in a house with Cassine's personal seal on the door, Thomas Marlowe was sitting in a room he hadn't chosen, carrying a debt to people who had decided he was currency. A pattern, Elena thought, with the cold precision of a woman who had grown up inside that pattern, that ended today. It ended today because she and the man beside her were done paying other people's debts in blood. The horses hit the road at a run, and the 12 hours began, and the capital was 2 hours ahead of them with a countess and a council, and a man who had spent a decade being patient, finally about to learn what it looked like when the person he'd underestimated stopped waiting. They reached Lady Hartwell's house with 40 minutes to spare. The countess answered the door herself, which told Adrian that she'd been awake, which told him she'd been expecting something. Not them specifically, but the shape of a crisis arriving before the session opened, the way old players in long games develop a sense for when the board is about to tip. She was 70 years old and dressed for the day already, her white hair pinned with the precision of someone who had decided,
at some point in her 7th decade, that she would meet whatever came next fully prepared or not at all. She looked at Adrian. She looked at Elena. She looked at the documents under Elena's arm. "Come inside," she said. "I'll have coffee made." They sat at her breakfast table while Pell laid the documents and Lady Hartwell read, with the focused, unhurried attention of a woman who had reviewed more legal arguments than most advocates saw in a career. She did not ask questions while she read. She turned pages with the steady rhythm of someone who needed to reach the end before she formed a view. When she finished, she set the last page down and looked at Adrian. "You should have brought this to me 6 months ago," she said. "I didn't know who I could trust 6 months ago," he said. She looked at him with the specific patience of someone who has heard insufficient reasons for a very long time and has made peace with the inadequacy of human judgment. "You could have trusted me, Adrian. I sat at your father's table for 15 years. She paused. "But that is a conversation for another day." She looked at Elena. "You built this case." "We built it together," Elena said. Hartwell studied her. "You've been Duchess for 6 weeks." "Yes."
"And in 6 weeks you managed to uncover a network that's been operating in that castle for the better part of a decade." It wasn't a question, it was an assessment, delivered with the flat directness of someone who had no remaining patience for false modesty in either direction. "Your mother was a Cavendish, wasn't she? That family always produced people who saw around corners." Elena said nothing, but something in her face shifted. The particular careful shift of someone receiving an acknowledgement they hadn't known they needed until it arrived. Hartwell stood. "I'll hold the procedural vote. 30 minutes is all I can guarantee. Cassine has Elroy and Marsh, and Elroy will push hard for immediate measures the moment he sees your submission." She looked at Adrian. "You'll need to speak first, not through an advocate. You, personally, on the floor." "I know." "And the girl?" She glanced at Elena. "They requested her presence specifically. She should speak too. The council floor isn't a place for—" "She's the Duchess of Valemont," Hartwell said, with a sharpness that ended the sentence cleanly. "The council floor is exactly the place for her, particularly given that half of what Cassine intends to present concerns her." She moved toward the door. "My carriage is faster than whatever you rode in on. We leave in 10 minutes. The council chamber in the capital was built to make individuals feel small, which was, Elena had come to understand, the entire architectural point. High ceilings, stone walls, a raised dais for the 7 council seats, and a floor-level position for those presenting. The geometry of the space was designed to establish, before a word was spoken, who held the authority and who was asking for it. She had stood in rooms designed to diminish her before. She knew how to take up the correct amount of space regardless of the room's opinion about how much she deserved. They arrived with 11 minutes before the session opened. Cassine was already there. She saw him as they entered, a tall man of 60 with silver hair and the particular ease of someone who has arranged the room before the guests arrive. He watched Adrian cross the floor with the expression of a chess player watching an opponent make what he believes to be a predictable move. He hadn't seen the documents yet. He hadn't seen Hartwell come in behind them. The flicker in his composure when he registered the Countess was small and rapidly controlled, but Elena was close enough to catch it, and she filed it in the same careful place she filed everything, evidence that the gap between what he'd planned and what was actually happening had just opened by a degree he hadn't anticipated. The session opened. Elroy, one of Cassine's bloc, immediately moved to begin with Cassine's submission, the procedural maneuver designed to frame everything that followed. Hartwell raised her hand before the motion could be seconded and said, with the measured authority of 20 years on this council, that as the senior member present, she was exercising her right to hear new evidence before procedural motions, and that this right was documented in the Council Charter Section 4, Paragraph 7, which she could recite from memory if Elroy required it. Elroy did not require it. Hartwell looked at Adrian. "The floor is yours, Your Grace." Bassam. He spoke for 20 minutes. Elena had not heard him speak at length before. Not like this, not in a room that required something from him beyond operational brevity. She had heard him give instructions, heard him answer questions, heard him in the quiet of the corridor at 2 a.m. with his walls fractured and his voice raw. She had not heard him argue. He argued the way he did everything, without performance, without the cultivated passion of men who had learned to use emotion as a tool. He laid the case with the flat structural precision of someone who understood that the truth, presented clearly, was more persuasive than any rhetorical embellishment because it required no maintenance. He walked the council through Cassine's network, the correspondence chain, Marin's seal, Rourke's access to guard rotations, the debt manipulation used against Thomas, the planted agent and the kitchen staff. And he did it in the order that made each piece the foundation of the next, so that by the time he reached the arrow through Elena's window, the council had the full architecture, and the arrow was simply the inevitable conclusion of a structure they'd watched him build in real time. He did not ask for sympathy. He did not use the words, "I was betrayed," or "I suffered," or any of the vocabulary of victimhood that councils responded to with discomfort. He presented facts with the confidence of someone who believed, deeply and without performance, that facts were sufficient, that the truth didn't need to be sold, only shown. When he finished, there was a silence that was different from the procedural silence of a pause between speakers. It was the silence of people recalibrating. Cassine's advocate rose, made the case they'd built over months, the trade route documents, the alleged fraud, the correspondence that was meant to implicate Elena. It was a good case, constructed carefully, documented thoroughly. In a room without Marin's exposed correspondence and Dre's testimony, it would have been devastating. Cassine watched the council as his advocate spoke. He watched the faces. And somewhere in the third minute, Elena saw him understand. Not from anything said, but from the quality of the council's attention, the way Hartwell was watching his advocate with the expression of someone listening to an argument they already know has a fatal structural flaw, that the room had already moved. He looked at Elena. She met his gaze. She kept her face neutral and her spine straight, and she did not look away, because looking away was what you did when you were uncertain of your ground, and she had not been uncertain of her ground since 2 a.m. in the study with the correspondence chain spread on the desk and the fire burning and one man across the table who had decided she was worth building beside. Hartwell called her to speak. She stood. She had thought, in the carriage, about what to say. She had thought about argument, about framing, about the legal architecture of the case, and where her voice could add structure. She had prepared 3 different approaches and dismissed all of them on the ride, and arrived at the council chamber with nothing scripted, which was either very brave or very stupid, and she had decided, somewhere on the road between Valemont and the capital, that she was done calibrating the difference. She spoke for 8 minutes. She did not speak about the case. Adrian had covered the case. She spoke about the duchy, about the household accounts she'd spent 6 weeks reading, the staff roster she'd memorized, the drainage records and agricultural surveys, and the small, specific accumulated evidence of a territory that was managed by someone who gave a damn about the people inside it. She spoke about the man Cassine's submission characterized as a fraudulent administrator, and she characterized instead through the particular evidence of his daily choices, the ones that didn't make it into legal documents, the fire in her sitting room that was always lit before she arrived, the book that appeared on her desk, the quiet removal of a courtier who'd overstepped, the way he'd read a writ at dawn with the world coming apart around him, and said, simply, "Ride with me." She did not say that last thing to the council. She said it in her own mind and understood that it was the center of everything she'd been trying to say, the plain, sufficient truth of it. She had arrived at Valemont Castle as a transaction and had been treated, in every small and uncatalogued way, as something considerably more valuable than that, by a man who was so committed to not doing exactly that, that he'd spent 6 weeks doing it entirely without acknowledgement. What she told the council was that the Duchy of Valemont was not a failing administration requiring intervention. It was a duchy under sustained, documented attack by a political actor with enough patience to build a case over years and enough reach to place assets inside the household itself. She laid it simply. She let the documents do the weight-bearing, and she finished by looking directly at the council and saying, "You were given a submission this morning by Lord Cassine. I ask you to read it alongside the submission filed by my husband 2 hours prior. Read them together with the chain of correspondence between them, and tell me which one has something to hide." She sat down. The chamber was quiet. Then Hartwell called the vote. It was not clean. Nothing in rooms like this was clean. Elroy objected procedurally twice. Marsh demanded a recess to review the documentary evidence, which Hartwell granted for 20 minutes, and which Adrian spent standing at the window of the council anteroom with his hands at his sides and his face turned away from the room, and Elena standing close enough that their arms were almost touching, not quite touching, in the specific geography of two people who had run out of managed distance. "If Marsh votes against us," he said, not asking, running the math. "He won't," she said. "You don't know that." He looked at the SEAL correspondence for 11 minutes during the recess. She paused. When a council member looks at exculpatory evidence for 11 minutes, he's not looking for reasons to dismiss it. He's looking for reasons to use it. He turned his head and looked at her. "You counted," he said. "I always count," she said. Something crossed his face. The thing that had been trying to get out since the study at 2 a.m, since the corridor at midnight, since the courtyard in the gray pre-dawn of a morning that felt like it belonged to a different era of his life. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape his face made when a smile had stopped being foreign to it. Marsh voted with them, 5-2. The provisional removal motion was rejected. Cassine's submission was referred for independent review, which was the procedural equivalent of being set on fire slowly. Dre's testimony and Marin's correspondence were entered into the council's formal record, which meant they existed now in a form that couldn't be quietly managed. Cassine left the chamber without speaking. He did not look at Adrian. He looked, briefly, at Elena. And she read in that look something she hadn't expected. Not hatred, not contempt, but the specific, exhausted recognition of a man who had spent a decade building something and watched it come apart in a single morning at the hands of someone he hadn't accounted for. She had been the lever he'd tried to use against Adrian. She had become the thing that dismantled him instead. She thought, with a clarity that had no particular emotion attached to it, that this was what happened when you used people as instruments without accounting for the possibility that they had their own intentions. Thomas was released before noon. He arrived at the council building pale and disheveled and grabbed Elena's arm in the corridor with the expression of a man who had spent 12 hours understanding something the hard way. "Elena," he said, "I'm sorry. I had no idea they were—" "I know," she said. "I made it worse. Every time I tried to fix it, I made it—" "Thomas." She put her hand on his arm. "It's over. You're going home." She paused. "And then you're going to sit down with a financial advisor who has no connection to the capital's court system, and you're going to fix your accounts properly, and you're going to stop trying to manage consequences alone." She looked at him. "You're not as bad at this as you think you are. You're just stubborn in the wrong directions." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face did what faces did when someone told them the truth without cruelty. "You've changed," he said. "I've had a good 6 weeks," she said. 10. They rode back to Valemont in the late afternoon. Not at speed this time. The horses moved at an easy pace along the road that ran north from the capital through flat farming country, and the sky was doing the thing it did in late autumn in this part of the kingdom, turning the particular deep gold that lasted for an hour before the dark came and made the whole world look briefly like something out of a different life. She rode beside him, not at a careful distance. Beside him, close enough that she could have reached out without effort. Neither of them spoke for a while. It was the good silence again. The one that didn't require anything, that had been built through 6 weeks of shared proximity and crisis and the accumulated weight of two people who had learned each other's architecture in the dark. He broke it. "I owe you an accounting," he said. She glanced at him. "Of what?" 6 weeks ago I stood in your doorway and told you not to expect anything from me." He was looking at the road ahead. His voice had the quality it got when he was saying something he'd been running through his mind for a while and had finally decided to say plain. "I said it clearly. I said it without apology." "You did." "I was wrong." He paused. "Not about what I was capable of at the time. I probably wasn't capable of anything different at the time, but wrong about the fixed nature of it. Wrong about treating it as a permanent condition rather than a current one." She watched the road. "Adrian," she said, let me finish." She let him finish. "I've been treating loss as an argument against caring," he said, "as though the fact that things can be taken means the rational response is to not hold them. Marcus, my father, the first years of the duchy, when everything was structured around protecting what was left by making as small a target as possible, he exhaled. That logic works, up to a point. And then it stops working, and what you're left with is a castle that runs like a machine, and a life that has no... He stopped. No one in it who knows your actual name. She was very still. You know my name, she said. Yes, he said. I do. The road ran through a stand of old trees, and for a moment the gold light was interrupted by shadow, and then returned. And when it returned, he had looked away from the road and was looking at her, and she thought, not for the first time and not with any surprise anymore, that his face in unguarded moments was completely different from the face he showed the world. Not softer, exactly, more present. The difference between a room with the shutters closed and the same room with them open. I'm not going to tell you I love you, he said. Not today. Not because it isn't true. I think it's been true for longer than I've had a name for it, but because it's too large to say cleanly right now, and I'd rather say it when I can mean the full weight of it. She looked at him. That's the most precise thing anyone has ever said to me, she said. Something in his face moved. The almost smile. When I say it, he said, I want you to know it's been earned, that it's not... He seemed to be choosing words with the care of someone who understood that the wrong ones would hollow the right ones out. That it's not the declaration of a man who got lucky in a crisis and confused gratitude for something deeper. Is that what you think you feel? He held her gaze. No? Then say what you feel. He looked at her for a long, still moment on the road between the capital and home. The gold light was holding. The horses moved. The world was quiet in the specific way it was quiet after sustained violence. Not peaceful exactly, but resting, the way ground rested after a storm that had finally finished with it. I feel like I've been standing outside my own life for 3 years, he said, and you walked through the front door, and I've been deciding what to do about that every day since. She turned that over. What did you decide? She said. To stop deciding, he said. To stop treating it as a problem to be managed and start treating it as the thing it actually is. Which is, he looked at her, the only thing in the last 3 years that's made the castle feel like a place worth coming back to, he said. The trees fell away. The road opened out onto the long approach to Valemont, the duchy's edge visible in the distance, boundary wall, then rooftops, then the dark shapes of the towers against the autumn sky. Home, she thought, and was slightly astonished by the ease of the word, by the fact that it arrived without qualification or amendment, that it simply settled into place with the certainty of something that had been true for a while and was only now being acknowledged. She reached across the space between their horses. He met her hand in the air between them. She held it. He held back. They rode the last mile to Valemont like that, with the light going gold, and then amber, and then the first edge of dark, and neither of them let go. 3 weeks later, Adrian Vale called the duchy's court to formal assembly. Elena had not been told what he intended. She had been told to be in the Great Hall at noon, which was either a significant event or a moderately significant one, and she had dressed accordingly and arrived early, which was her habit, and had spent 5 minutes wondering and 10 minutes watching the court assemble with the same careful attention she brought to everything, and then stopped wondering because the answer was usually in the room if you looked at it correctly. He came in from the east entrance, which was the formal entrance, in his formal coat and with his chamberlain at his shoulder, and the court did the thing it did when he entered. The involuntary straightening, the temperature shift, the room arranging itself around his presence the way iron filings arranged around a field. He crossed the floor to where she was standing and stopped. He turned to face the assembled court. The Duchy of Valemont, he said, has been under the governance of the Vale family for 4 generations. The title of Duke carries with it administrative authority over territory, trade, and the legal structures of this house. He paused. This administration has, for the past 3 years, been a single authority structure. That ends today. The room was absolutely silent. Elena Vale, Duchess of Valemont, he said. is hereby formally recognized not as a consort title, but as co-administrator of the duchy with full decision-making authority in matters of household governance, legal petition, and diplomatic correspondence. Her signature carries the same weight as mine on all duchy documents." He turned his head and looked at her directly. "This is not a courtesy. It is an accounting. She has earned it." She met his gaze across the assembled court of people who had watched her arrive as a transaction 6 weeks prior and were now watching a duke who did not make statements lightly make the most unambiguous statement of his adult life. She had not expected this. She had expected, if she was honest, a continuation of what was already happening. The slow, unannounced, unceremonious accumulation of actual partnership, expressed through shared counsel and practical authority, and the small, daily evidence of being trusted. She had not expected him to say it in public. He was a private man. He managed his interior life with the same precision he managed everything else. The fact that he was standing in his own great hall in front of his entire court, making an explicit declaration was, she understood it in her chest before she understood it in her mind, the most significant thing he knew how to do. He was a man who showed rather than said, and he had decided for her to say. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. Quiet, direct. The way she'd said thank you for being direct on their wedding night, which felt like a century ago and felt like last week, and felt, she was discovering, like the beginning of something she hadn't known she was in the middle of until it was already most of the way built. The faint line at the corner of his mouth, the almost smile that had been getting easier. "Don't thank me," he said, just as quiet. "It's not a gift. It's what's accurate." The court began to stir around them. The chamberlain moved toward the formal documentation. The household's momentum resumed, the way it did, the way life did. Not with fanfare, not with the sustained dramatic intensity of everything that had preceded it, but with the ordinary, durable rhythm of two people who had decided to occupy the same territory and were learning daily what that meant. Later that evening, she found him in the study. He was at his desk with documents and tea and the lamp burning and the fire built high, in the same position she'd found him in 100 times in 6 weeks. And the difference was that he looked up when she came in, and something in his face settled in a way that hadn't happened when she first arrived. The specific, almost invisible relaxation of a man whose walls were still standing but had stopped needing to be manned quite so constantly. She sat across the desk from him. Not at her own table. At his desk, across from him, in the chair she'd sat in the morning, the window shattered and everything began to change. "Rourke," she said, "what happens to him?" He set down his pen. "He'll be tried. The evidence is clear enough that the outcome isn't uncertain." He paused. He knew what he was doing. He made his choice. "Do you understand why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Not yet. Maybe I will, eventually." He looked at the fire. "He was with me a long time. Whatever I missed in him, I missed it consistently." A pause. "That's mine to carry." "It is," she said, "but carrying it doesn't mean you caused it." He looked at her. "No," he agreed, "it doesn't." She understood what it cost him to say that. The specific difficulty of a man who had spent years convinced that the damage around him was evidence of his own fundamental deficiency, that the people who left or betrayed or died were leaving something insufficient rather than doing what people did, which was make their own choices for their own reasons in a world that didn't organize itself around any single person's culpability. She understood it because she had run a version of the same logic about her own life, had spent years treating the indifference around her as evidence of her own inadequacy rather than her circumstances' limitations. The work of stopping that, of learning to distinguish between what you're responsible for and what was never yours to carry. It was not fast work, and it was not clean work, and it was, she had come to believe, the most essential work a person could do, the kind that didn't show from the outside, but changed the interior completely, the way a building could be utterly transformed by what happened to its foundation without a single exterior wall changing its position. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "On our wedding night," she said, "when you told me not to expect love from you, I decided you were probably right. Not because I believed you were incapable of it, but because I was protecting myself from hoping for something I'd been told wasn't available. She looked at him. I spent 6 weeks doing that, working very hard not to want what was very obviously forming between us. I know, he said. I was watching. How long did you know? He held her gaze for a moment. The pale eyes, which she had spent 6 weeks reading and now understood well enough to see what was in them. The morning you told the portrait gallery to go to hell, he said. Not the words. The way you came back to your desk afterward and opened drainage records. He paused. That was when I understood I was in a significant amount of trouble. She laughed. It was not a social laugh. Not the careful, modulated version she'd used in courts and at dinner tables for 22 years. It was the real one. The one that came from the part of her that didn't have a performance attached to it, that existed before and underneath and entirely outside the management of other people's expectations. He looked at her like the sound of it had done something structural to him. She reached across the desk. He put his hand in hers. Outside the study windows, Valemont lay in the quiet of a November evening, the boundary walls and the east garden and the northern ridgeline going dark against a sky that still held the last thin line of light along its edge. The castle that had felt like a tomb in September and had felt like a battlefield in October and felt now, in the plain warmth of a fire, and two people holding something between them that neither of them had thought they deserved, like the specific and ordinary thing it had always had the potential to be. A home. Not the absence of difficulty. Not the conclusion of damage or the resolution of every debt the past had run up against the present. Both of them carried things that would take years to lay down, and they understood this without pretending otherwise, which was itself a kind of maturity. The understanding that better was not the same as finished, that two people choosing each other across the ruins of their own walls was not the end of the work, but the beginning of the part that was worth doing. Adrian Vale had told her on their wedding night that he had no capacity for this. He had been wrong in the specific, instructive way that people are wrong when they mistake the current condition for a permanent one, when they confuse what the damage has made them into with what they are underneath the damage, when they build their walls so high and maintain them so well that they genuinely cannot remember what they were fortifying in the first place, that somewhere under all the load-bearing structure was a person who had simply wanted, as people do, to matter to someone. He mattered. She looked at him across the desk in the firelight, this man who had spent 3 years making himself small enough that the world couldn't take anything else from him, who had spent 6 weeks losing that battle to her daily presence and fighting it, and losing again, and finally, in the dark of a corridor with her hand in his, deciding that losing was acceptable, that some losses were not losses at all, but the dissolution of something that should have been let go a long time ago. The Duke who had forbidden love had become the man most committed to protecting it, not because love had made him soft, because it had made him honest, because the walls, once lowered, revealed someone with considerably more to offer the world than the walls had ever suggested. Someone whose capacity for loyalty, for rigor, for the specific and durable form of care that showed up as a lit fire in a found book and a quiet removal of every obstacle placed in his wife's path, turned out to be not a vulnerability at all, but the truest form of the strength he'd always been credited with. She already knew this. She had mapped it over 6 weeks with the careful attention of someone who had decided very early that what was actually here was worth understanding. He was still learning it. That was all right. She had time. I should finish these before dinner, he said, glancing at the documents. Yes, she said. She didn't let go of his hand. He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her. The almost smile. He left the documents.